Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Cybersecurity Weekly. I'm your host, Fred Cobb, Executive VP and CISO at InfoSystems. And I'm happy to have Mr. Tim Morton with us today. Tim is with InfoSystems as well. He's our engineering team lead as well as subject matter expert in networking and cybersecurity services and products and everything in between. So, Tim, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Fred. It's really great to be here.
Yes, absolutely. Looking forward to our topic today. As those of you that have been tuning in previously to our podcast know, we are going through the Center for Internet Security Critical Security Controls all the way from 1 to 20. And happy to report we are up to number 12. We've got some great information that we've done to date. So those of you that haven't listened previously, please go back when you have a moment and listen to some of our previous recordings as we step through these very important controls that can really help you with your cyber program development, just tightening things up in your environment, some best practices that you should be bringing into just the day-to-day activities that you do at your business. So without further ado, let's jump right into number 12. So Tim, let's talk a little bit today about boundary defense. And I'll just ask you a couple of questions just right off the bat here. When you think about a network and boundary defense, what typically comes to mind when you're thinking about that?
Yeah, Fred, that's a great question. Number one to me would be securing the perimeter, and that would be anywhere along the lines of a DMZ, keeping those things blocked off from internal networks, segregating out secure VLANs is another big portion of it as well. And really with the end goal of keeping attackers out. That's really the main focus of this CSC number 12.
Absolutely. You mentioned DMZs or Demilitarized Zones. That's where that term derived from. When you think about the architecture of a DMZ, one thing I've always done as a general rule is, let's say you've got a web server, and let's say you've got a front end, that's the web server service itself. That's the web pages that people hit when they're coming in from the untrusted or internet networks. And let's say you have a back-end database. So, with a DMZ, a good rule of thumb there would be maybe to put the web server itself behind the edge firewall in this DMZ, and then have the proper holes poked through the internal firewall for the web server to maybe talk to a back-end SQL server or whatever it needs to communicate with to provide web content. Is that a typical good design for a DMZ, or one use case, I guess?
It is, Fred. That's a very good way to describe it. That's exactly what you want to do. Allow only the business critical or business needed traffic and block all other traffic. That's really the best design for overall security.
Yeah, absolutely. And on previous episodes and in discussions with various guests, we've talked about firewalls. Obviously, firewalls are key to the perimeter defense that you just spoke of. So having those rules in place, of course, in the DMZ configuration that we just talked about, really you're talking about two firewalls, aren't you? Or at least two interfaces in the single firewall.
Exactly. You can think of it as two separate firewalls, but with modern firewalls now, you really do it by either zones or different sets of policies. But yeah, you would really have two completely separate policies for your DMZ networks versus your internal networks. Good point.
Yep. Thanks, Tim. Another thing too is we're talking about all the different layers, and peeling back this onion of what you consider defense in depth, or the different layers of security. Another common term that I'd like to spend just a minute or two talking about, actually two terms, is IDS or intrusion detection versus intrusion prevention or IPS. Can Tim, in kind of describing the differences between the two, and there are some very distinct differences, but they complement each other. And I think in just about every scenario, really both can be justified in a configuration for your boundary defense. But if I could get your take on IDS versus IPS for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely, Fred. Great question. When you think about IPS versus IDS, it's really a matter of what do you want to do with the traffic that you're detecting as malicious, and you can either drop that traffic or prevent it completely, or you can allow it through and report on it and act on it after the fact. So those two ideas in mind, that's how you kind of decide whether you want to use an IPS versus an IDS. So an IPS is going to be the technology that prevents those connections, and an IDS is going to be the detection service instead. So that's really the main criteria that you want to look for when deciding on whether to use one or the other. And they do complement each other. That's a very good point, Fred. There is some overlap where you may have an IPS system that can do some IDS functionality. So there's some complementary features there as well. Really depends on your environment, what you want to deploy, and it's a matter of, do you want to block or do you want to allow and report after the fact?
We'll be back with the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast after we pause for this special message. Security analysts believe cyber attacks will continue to escalate throughout 2020 and are recommending that every company, regardless of industry or size, place immediate focus on cybersecurity training and the tools that will protect you from these attacks. Did you know that you can book a cybersecurity assessment right now with Fred Cobb's team of cybersecurity engineers at InfoSystems? They will help you discover exactly where you are most vulnerable to a cyber attack and make recommendations on how to strengthen your defense in those areas. This is urgent. It's an issue that affects everyone in our community. Visit the InfoSystems website at www.infosystems.biz to request your cybersecurity assessment. Now back to the podcast.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's spot on. And to me, when I think about, somebody says, what's the difference? How do you compare IDS to IPS? I always use the term, think of intrusion detection as what you said just a moment ago, Tim, a monitoring application or a way to look for nefarious activity based on known threats, through your IDS system getting, one or more threat feeds. And then, so you've got the monitoring piece there. And then, to your point that you just made, think of intrusion prevention as a control mechanism. In other words, you're controlling sort of like, think about a firewall policy. Well, you're building policies in your intrusion prevention system that says based on this data type, various other attributes that, you're looking at the packets as they're coming into the environment, or operating on a layer 7, at an application layer even. You're simply not allowing that traffic through. And there's this, I don't know if it's so much these days, but for years, a lot of people were worried about intrusion prevention systems either generating false positives or blocking legitimate data flow because of misconfigurations. And, to some extent, I think that's still a thing, but it's become less of a thing over time, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would, Fred. I would agree. And it's a matter of, knowing your system that you're deploying and actively monitoring it and tuning it and keeping on top of the alerts that are coming out of it. It's really important to not neglect that system once it's installed.
Mm-hmm. Very good. It goes without saying, too, and we've covered this in a previous episode, where, let's say you unbox a firewall or you unbox an appliance, maybe an IDS system or an IPS system. But let me focus on the firewall for just a moment. As we've mentioned with previous episodes, it's very important to take that device, that firewall, and immediately harden that device. First thing you need to do is change the default credentials, because bad guys know on the manufacturer's devices typically what the default username passwords are whenever you unbox the device and plug it into the network. So in part of your boundary defense, you need to start tightening that device up as soon as you get it plugged in, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a critical step. Right out of the box, change the password, set up a unique user account with a strong password, enable multi-factor authentication if you can. That's another good step, especially on administrator type accounts on those firewall devices.
Right. And certainly, as we've mentioned previously, use those either disastigs or those CIS benchmarks. There's plenty of documentation out there for all these devices that may be coming online in your environment. So it takes a lot of the guesswork. Well, how do I make this thing optimized from a cybersecurity perspective without either breaking it or leaving gaps in what I've configured? Rely on those documents that are very thorough, and they can help you set up some, lots of pertinent security parameters around those devices.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that, Fred. That's something that our info systems engineers really specialize in, is taking those benchmarks and applying them to live production gear.
Absolutely. I guess one of the last things I want to touch on in this episode, we've talked about DMZs, we've talked about firewalls, we've talked about VLANs, we've talked about IDS, IPS, but really, when you think about boundary defense, it comes all the way down these days to the endpoint device. You've got the capability nowadays to have much more sophisticated antivirus or antivirus applications on an endpoint device. I'm thinking things like a Cylance, which is now BlackBerry Spark, or I'm thinking about maybe Carbon Black. I mean, what are some of the things you can do with those endpoint applications, Tim, that would help with your boundary defense?
Yeah, it's a very good point, Fred. You know how it goes. Attackers try to get into an internal system, and then they'll try to pivot off those to gain access to other parts of their network. So it's very important to protect the endpoint. Yeah, great solutions from Carbon Black, Cylance that you've mentioned that help really go to the next step beyond what traditional antivirus has gotten us. So you're really looking at more of a advanced behavior type analysis and blocking there, a lot more advanced than traditional AV.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, let's go ahead and wrap this episode up. For those of you out there listening, please take some time, look at what not only CSC Control number 12 has to say, which is what we're talking about today, but certainly go back, as we ask you to do and recommend that you do, go back and revisit some of the information in regards to all the top 20 controls. There's great information in there. We're going to be continuing on, making it all the way through CSC Control 20 before we end this series. And please stay tuned for upcoming episodes. And thank you for tuning in today. And I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.